Everyone wants a decent place to live and one that doesn't eat up all their income. But a home you can afford seems increasingly hard to find. Mortgage payments are rising for millions as people come off fixed deals. Rents are going up too. Properties for rent snapped up within minutes, and social housing lists that can be as long as a decade. In a minute, we'll discuss what it feels like at the sharp end, what's going wrong and what can be done to put it right. We'll be hearing from those struggling to keep a roof over their head, to the builders and sellers, the renters and the planners, as we debate Britain's housing crisis. But first, one sector that does seem to be doing well out of this crisis is the banking industry. Let's get more from our economics correspondent, Helia Ebrahimi. Heli.
Well, we heard earlier from Amelia about Centrica's windfall. Well, profits have gone up at Barclays too. They've gone up to £4.6 billion for the half year. That's largely off the back of rising interest rates. That creates fertile ground for bank profits. But for millions of mortgage holders, they face the cliff edge as they roll off their fixed-rate mortgages this year of around 2 or 3% and roll on to charges of much more close to 6% plus. Now, the Barclays chief executive this morning said that a quarter of Barclays mortgage customers are now so worried about this that they're making extra payments to pay down capital as they face into the storm of this new mortgage market. And of course, profit margins at banks have been so controversial. Barclays say this is set to come down. That will be welcome news for the Chancellor, who's been pressing them to support customers more. And of course, Jackie, this is all incredibly critical because next week we're expecting yet another rate rise from the Bank of England.
And Helia, what's the long-term picture on whether people can actually afford to buy at all?
Well, mortgages have become unaffordable because rising interest rates, but increasingly there is a structural problem with house prices because they've rocketed in recent decades, completely dislocated from the amount of money that people are earning. The Office for National Statistics say that anything over 5 times your income is unaffordable, but today's figures show it's now more than that in the North East. In Wales, it's 6.4 times, and on average across the UK, house prices are now 8.4 times your income. But the highest disparity, Jackie, is in London, where it's a startling 14 times. The end result is that increasingly the dream of owning your home is becoming remote for people. Now, that obviously also has a knock-on effect, not just because of mortgages, but because of house prices, to renters and those who own.
Very much. So let's start with mortgages, the biggest and quickest change in recent months. About a third of all adults, 14 million people, have a mortgage. The Institute for Fiscal Studies calculates they're now facing an extra £280 a month in payments on average, which means finding another £3,360 a year. As a result, their disposable income will drop by more than 8%. But those are the average impacts. For example, the IFS think there will be 1.4 million people who will see their disposable incomes drop by a fifth. And interest rates have shot higher since these figures were calculated. So the hit is going to be bigger. Well, I'm going to start with you, Amber Seaver. You are a social worker and a single mum to 2 teenagers. Tell me how you've already been impacted by mortgage rate rises.
Yes, so I think I probably represent an average family on average income in the UK, but we've been massively hit by the huge hike in interest rates that has come very, very quickly. And so our mortgage is up for renewal in September. And when we've looked into it and done our research, the best mortgage that we could find was about an extra £400 per calendar month. So we've had to make the really difficult
that's huge,
decision.
Isn't it?
It's huge. And it's also on top of rising food costs, energy costs, fuel costs. So we've had to make the difficult decision to put a house on the market and sell and reduce our mortgage.
I mean, obviously that is a financial decision, but there's huge emotional impact, isn't there, too?
There is. I mean, we've been in our family home for 22 years. We've worked on it and built it up, and we honestly thought we'd be there forever. So it's come with a huge impact. We've got to change, we've got to move location, and it's really sad. And I think it's also made me feel quite angry because I feel that our government, our current government, doesn't understand the average person, the average income person who is having to budget every month.
I mean, did you look at other options? I know, as you say, this has happened really, really quickly. Did you look at other options to see whether there was help around, whether there was anything else you could do?
Yeah, I'm really lucky because I've got a very excellent mortgage advisor, and she's been with me a long time. And together we sat down and looked at what we could do. But even interest-only mortgages were going to increase my monthly expenditure by about £150. So there just wasn't any option.
I mean, Stuart Hare, you're the CEO of Skipton Building Society. We've heard some uncomfortable listening for a lot of people about bank and building society profits. What do you feel when you listen to Amber's story?
Well, I've been sitting chatting to Amber, and it is heartbreaking. I think of the family home that I grew up in and having to swap out of that to a different home. It's obviously going to have a huge emotional impact. I think we have to separate banks from building societies. Banks, yes, profits recognised through investors. With building societies, the money that we make gets reinvested.
But
to
it's still a big
pricing.
profit you're making.
All of that money is for our members because they're our owners. But what we have to do is we have to offer support. We have to make sure that we are offering support to both our savers, to make sure they're getting fair rates, but also to the likes of Amber. We've got to make sure that those support packages, such as the mortgage charter, developing product, etc., is there. But in circumstances like your own, unfortunately, with the price of money going up, the cost of money going up through base rate, it's a very difficult circumstance.
So briefly, if you had been advising Amber, do you think you'd have had to say, do what you're doing, sell up?
Unfortunately, yes, and Amber's not alone. People are having to face in not just increased costs of mortgages, but you'll have seen the increased costs of energy and, of course, all our food staples as well. So these are really difficult choices that people are having to make.
I mean, we're joined now by the Conservative MP, Bob Seely. Bob Seely, I hope you heard what Amber was saying there about having to move. She says the government is out of touch. It doesn't understand what ordinary people are going through at the minute.
Hi, I'm very sorry to hear of Amber's situation, and I'm very sorry to hear she's having to put her house on the market. The way that we can help people like Amber up and down the country is to get inflation down for everybody, because we need to get inflation down for everybody in order to get mortgage rates down for those folks who've got a mortgage. Last year, we did have 400,000 first-time buyers, which is the highest figure for 30 years. We've helped 800,000 people buy their own homes, and we are building on average, this government is building on average 50,000 more than the previous Labour government. Arguably, that's not enough. Arguably, we have to find ways of build more and build better.
Sorry to interrupt you, but if people can't afford to pay their mortgages, whether they're new buyers or people who've been in their homes for 22 years, that is a problem right now, isn't it?
It's a massive problem right now, and that's why we need to get inflation down. So from next year, or preferably earlier, mortgage rates can start to come down. I think one of the things that government could be looking at, and I would be very supportive of, and I don't quite understand why we don't have it in this country, is long-term fixed mortgages. So I think the longest fixed-term rate you can get in Britain easily is 5 years. So 2 years, very often 5 years maximum. I don't see why we can't have 10-year fixed rate, 15 or 20-year fixed rate, as they do in some other countries. So if Amber had mortgaged 2 or 3 or 4 years ago, she would know what her rate was, not only over that short period, but also in the medium and long term as well. So she would know that she wouldn't be remortgaging her house for a decade or more.
Bob Seely, thanks very much for that for the moment. Rachel Maskell from Labour. I mean, the plans that your Shadow Chancellor talked about for helping people with mortgages aren't really that different to what the current government is doing. What do you think of Bob Seely's plan? Do you have another plan that would help people like Amber right now?
Well, we've got to remember why we're in this situation. Of course, that was because of the economic situation created by the government last September when they crashed the economy. And as a result, now it's ordinary house owners which are paying the price. In York, we've seen a 23.1% increase in the cost of housing. So, of course, we need to give people an access to the housing market. And the housing market is so tight.
But for families like Amber's?
That's right. So it's pushing up the prices. prices. And then families like Amber's and others, of course, giving that support package and the confidence that people be able to stay in their home is really important. So that renegotiation is important. But what Rachel Reeves has been saying is that she would be talking with the banks and ensuring get the security
I mean, the government have met with lenders just last month.
But Jeremy Hunt clearly has not got the control over what is happening. We've seen that in the profit figures coming today. He needs to take a far harder stance on the banks at the moment, who clearly are profiting out of this crisis.
Well, let's move on to look at the rental market. Rents are surging as well, up by just over 5% in the year to June. That's the fastest annual growth rate for nearly 8 years. And you can see how it has really accelerated since the pandemic. So we have two renters here, James and Michael. Tell us your experience.
So I'm a renter in Manchester. I rent a house that's in disrepair, like a lot of houses that are rented in the UK. In April, my landlord, well, through the letting agency, got in touch to ask us about a 40% increase in our rent. We suggested that perhaps that was a little extortionate, and he very generously has gone down to a 30% increase in rent, which we're currently being evicted over. We suggested that perhaps if the rent was going to go up by 30%, they could fix some of the problems with our house. Like 1 in 10 rental properties in the UK, our house has damp, it has mould, and those are both hazardous to health. There was a very high-profile case of Awab Ishak in Rochdale who died, who was a 2-year-old who died because of the mould in his rental accommodation. So I'm sort of in a situation where I'm living in a normal, substandard house and being evicted because I don't want to pay 30% more rent to live somewhere which is hazardous to my health.
So I was in a situation where we were already paying an extortionate amount of rent. So I was paying about 45% of my paycheck. And in April, around the same time, we got told that our rent was going to be going up again. Our landlord owns the home outright. So he was talking about inflation, he was talking about the rising costs. That isn't true. That isn't true for a lot of the cases because a lot of homes are owned outright by landlords.
But do you accept that landlords are facing, some of them, higher mortgage rates like other homeowners?
Yeah, but if you're looking at what a mortgage is, it's not the same as paying normal bills. You're paying off a purchase. You bought that home and you are paying it off by doing this, and you make investments when you're buying a home. Sometimes you're not going to make as much money in that month.
Kay Sampson, a landlord, shaking your head vigorously there.
Because we are a business. We're not being treated as a business. We're not paying off mortgages. Most of us have got buy-to-let mortgages, which are interest only. I've got 3 coming up. I won't make any money on those 3. And I will be taxed as if I was making all that rent. I'm just going to try, with the other places that are still on good deals, I will try and cover all my losses, but I will be taxed as if I was earning a lot of money.
But you end up with a property at the end of it.
Yeah.
You own that property.
Not really, because I own 25% of the property. The bank really owns the property.
Well,
I own
what does the
25%.
mortgage do?
No, I pay interest only. I'm just paying the bank, really. It's a business, like I might have a factory.
But also, should it be a business when the thing that is at risk here is people having a home over their head, and also just when you're looking at it, it should not be a business.
Simi, can I just bring you in as a property developer, as another landlord? Yeah. I mean, do you hear what the young people are saying about the crisis that they feel they're in? As a landlord, what would you say to them directly?
The first thing is this. I'm very sorry that the gentleman finds himself having to give 45% of his paycheck to keep a roof over his head. However, for landlords and businesses such as mine, we were paying approximately 3% interest costs. That 3% has gone to 8% for me. So that means I've gone, you're talking about a 40%, your landlord's asked for you for a 40% increase, but the actual increase or the payments that we have to pay to is 100%. So you're still 60% better off in that situation. Now, the thing is this, it's sad that that's happening. But the reality is this, the costs of living, the costs of interest rates have gone up, and the landlord is passing those on to the tenant, because ultimately the consumer always has to be, the end consumer always has to pay.
But we're not passing it all on. I can't say 800 mine's gone up. I'm not going to ask them for 800 more. I'm just going to have to take the hit.
Perhaps
And
it's
use
a
the
business
other-
model that doesn't work.
Well, then there'll be nowhere for anyone to rent. I just rent.
Well, the houses would
property.
still be there.
you can't
Landlords like
afford to buy them.
landlords like to say that they provide housing, but what they do is they hoard it. A landlord is someone that owns more housing than they need.
But they do provide housing.
provide
that in the
housing.
current climate,
Housing's already
there is
there.
a big issue about it's 20 or 30% of landlords who have mortgages, big mortgages. Many
Yeah.
others don't have mortgages at all, so it is making profit.
I don't know about the people that have paid off the mortgages, but most people do have a mortgage. Most landlords got a mortgage, and we have to pay for that, and it's not making money anymore.
There is clearly a very, very big disconnect between the needs of renters not to face spiralling rents. Landlords, you are a business, as you openly say, and you want to make profit. But very briefly, what is the answer to this disconnect?
Well, I think the real housing crisis is that we don't treat housing as a basic human right, that people are expected to have to hand over 45 or maybe more % of their income just to not live on the streets.
And also, if you increase the amount of social housing that's being built, when you look at the number of people that you're competing with every time you're going to try and find a place to live, it's 1 in 20 where there's 20 people applying for a viewing of every single house that's available. When you don't have enough social housing, you have everyone below a certain price point all competing for that.
If I can stop you just for a second, I just want to bring in Bob Seeley at the moment. Bob Seeley, the government has moved, it says it's going to move to end Section 21 evictions in their renters' reform bill, but that just isn't going to happen quickly enough, is it?
Okay, let me tell you what the government is going to be doing on a lot of sympathy with the guys who are renting. We're giving the Renters Reform Act or the bill is going to give renters more rights. And we will scrap Section 21 evictions. So you can't just be kicked out without a reason. You can't be kicked out for complaining about rising damp or the boiler not working and then find out your landlord is just going to kick you out. But at the same time, we are going to make it easier for landlords to evict bad problem tenants. So we're trying to help both sides and create a better rental market. However, when it comes to the wider points, there is simply a lack of building in our inner cities. We have relied on too much greenfield development over the last 25, 30 years, even arguably 40 years, and we've had very little greenfield development. So you look at a place like the Isle of Wight, our population has gone up 50% since 1961. At the same time, Blackpool, Liverpool, Manchester, Birmingham, over that same period, have had an absolute decline in population.
We're going to come on to house
to build in inner cities.
We're going to come on to house building in just a moment, but Rachel Maskell, I mean, Section 21, the government says it's moving to end these no-fault evictions. What about rent controls? Very, very popular with tenants. Some of your Labour mayor's very keen on it. The Labour leadership was keen on it, but has changed its mind.
Well, we've got to look at how we control the market now, because clearly it is running away. And as a result, who is paying for this? The whole system is broken. I think we recognise that housing should be a value about providing shelter for someone, and instead it's become a business and now a means of making profit for large corporates as well as individuals, and we need to move away from that. The 1945 government grasped that, and they said the only way we can provide, this is Nye Bevan, the only way we can provide this is to give municipal authorities the power and the resources in order to build the housing. That is what we have to return to address the housing.
So
need
you're
of
happy
today.
with the fact that the Labour leadership have turned away from the idea of rent controls?
We are going to have to look at this, and I believe in places like York, rent controls are the only solution to address the runaway house prices.
Richard, from Zoopla, just very quick run through where this leaves the rental market.
The challenge with the rental market is it's just not grown in size since 2016, since the tax changes. Now higher mortgage rates are compounding the pressure on landlords, record immigration, higher mortgage rates keep more first-time buyers out of buying, so they're in the rental market. So the rental market's just got a huge supply squeeze. Rents are going to keep rising in line with earnings, if not higher, and we've just got to add more supply. We need to build more homes to boost the size of the rental market, and we've got to persuade all good landlords to stay in the rental market for as long as possible.
All roads lead to house building, which we'll come on to in a minute. But Salim Shafi from Money Buddies, who are you seeing through your door, and what are the
Renters
extent
and mortgage
of the
holders
problems?
and people struggling with cost of living. People are being bled dry at the moment to the point where they don't have enough income just to pay for the basics. A really important figure over the last 12 months ago, 4 to 5 out of 10 people we saw had what we call deficit budgets. That meant that they didn't have, after going through a full income expenditure, getting the budget down as much as possible, they didn't have enough income to cover their basics. Now that is 8 out of 10 people in the last 12 months. That means that people cannot afford survival, never mind pay for their mortgage. So something has really gone wrong in the system. And I have a challenge for the government here. Just a few weeks ago, the Chancellor was saying that, it's indicating that it's kind of okay to go into recession. I'd never heard that in my life before. No. So if the Chancellor is now allowed, so saying it's kind of okay to go into recession, we need to see greater measures from government on the banks, on the building societies and on the rental sector to protect people and keep them in their homes.
James Lewis, the leader of Leeds City Council, I mean, what is the wider impact? Because if people are hoping for social housing, across the country we have 1 million people on the list waiting.
The impact is our waiting lists for council housing are going up and up every year. We're building a few hundred council houses every year, but we've got 26,000 people waiting for social housing in Leeds at the moment, and 5,600 of those have the most urgent need. Of course, we have about 2,000 vacancies every year when council houses come free, but that gap is growing between the number of houses we have available and the number of people that have them. We need that investment in providing affordable and council housing to help people. Because council housing, unlike private rented council housing, it's secure. Once people are in there, they're in there, and we need that council housing now. We're doing our bit in Leeds to start to build council housing. We build about 200 every year, but it's frankly a drop in the ocean from what we need.
James Lewis for now, thank you very much. Just over 200,000 homes were built across the country last year, below the 300,000 total the government says is needed. We haven't seen that volume of house building since the mid-70s under governments of any stripe. Well, the PM was out and about today in London saying we're not building enough homes in the capital. Are we building enough homes anywhere? Tom Forth from Open Innovations.
No. And we've not been building enough homes anywhere for at least 20 years. That's part of the huge problem. And I think a lot of what we're hearing now is the chickens coming home to roost a little bit. We've not built enough for the last 20 years, and now we've got a problem. So the government might celebrate building 240,000 homes this year, similar numbers to that in England, and they'll say that's brilliant. In the same time period, France built 380,000, and they were a bit disappointed. Whilst we were celebrating 240,000, the French were like, oh dear, we missed our target of 400,000 again, must do better next year. And none of these problems, the very detailed and complex problems, there's a really simple solution. No other detailed and complex solution fixes it unless you also build loads more homes.
Peter Truscott, Crest Nicholson, you're in the business of building homes. I'm assuming you won't argue with any of that. We have heard successive governments talking about building more and more homes, but it's not being done, is it? Why not?
No, well, certainly we won't be building 240,000 homes this year, Jackie. I think that it was an interesting answer from Bob when he was talking about inner city urban regeneration. I think that's a very good political answer because it's telling the Tory faithful in the south of England, don't worry, we can resolve the housing crisis and it won't affect you. The reality is that that is part of the solution. But most of these inner city urban redevelopment areas tend to be in the Midlands and the north of England. They're not in the south. So telling somebody in the south that we can resolve your problem and we can house you in an apartment in Hull or Stoke-on-Trent or Bradford is not really going to cut it, is it? The real issue is the planning system. The planning system in the UK, we've got a first-class economy, but we've got a third-world planning system.
Let me put your points to Bob Seeley. Bob Seeley, you heard there what Peter is saying. What's your response to that?
I'm pretty sceptical about it, but he makes some intelligent points, but then he makes some unintelligent points with great respect to him. But let me put an argument to him, and I'm sure he can respond. The problem is not greenfield development because there's been vast amounts of it. The problem is that you actually had a decline in population in our great cities in the Midlands and the North. We also have a densely populated island and some of the lowest density cities in Europe. I'll give you an example. London, average density 9,000 people per square kilometre. Paris, 12,000. Sheffield, an outlier, 1,500 people per square kilometre. Barcelona, 16,000 people per square kilometre. We have very low density cities. It's unsustainable to keep building on greenfield and rely only on that. It is bad for productivity because we end up commuting longer, and we are building car-dependent, low-density housing estates, which are dreadful for our environmental commitments.
Bob, I'll let Peter come back to you very, very briefly if I can. Thanks, Bob. Peter, just come back to that.
Two responses to that, Bob. Firstly, if we want to have pull factors for the north to have people migrate from south to north, it's got to be more than just about cheap housing. It's got to involve economic regeneration. But most of the problem in the south of England at the moment that's stopping us building houses are the 145,000 houses that are blocked in the system because of things like nitrates, phosphates, water
Let
neutrality,
me bring Jackie
etc.
Copley in, Campaign to Protect Rural England. I mean, must be music to your ears this week when the Prime Minister set out his plans. We won't do that by concreting over the countryside. I mean, tell Peter why that's good news.
It is good news because our countryside, it's where we grow our food, it soaks up carbon. You know, there are huge amounts of benefits for people keeping countryside green. But CPRE recognises there is an affordable housing crisis, particularly in rural areas, actually. But we need to use our brownfield sites, of which they do exist. The problem is the planning system is bringing forward market homes. It's not concentrating on affordable. And we've done the research. We know probably 1 in 2 houses needs to be affordable, but the market is not delivering, and we need to decouple affordable housing from market.
Rachel Maskell.
Yeah, so we need to
Jackie,
reduce the cost.
Absolutely. I mean, it's the wrong kind of housing being built and completely unaffordable. So it's actually building this for investment and as assets as opposed to homes people can afford to live in. We're seeing that very much in the city of York. And on top of that, we've seen a sucking out of houses by the short-term holiday let industry, over 2,000 Airbnbs in York. That means 2,000 less families being able to access housing. So we need to control that sector and ensure that we build the houses that people need.
But what will Labour do about the Green Belt? Very briefly, if you can.
Well, Labour have said that we will not hold back, but brownfield first, making sure that we invest in the brownfield, of which there is a lot.
A possible hedging of bets.
Well, there's 1 million homes to be built in brownfield first, and that's where we will start. But of course, expanding on that, we all live on greenfield, something that was greenfield once upon a time, and making sure that we build sustainable communities, not just houses.
Ike EJ from the Policy Exchange. I mean, the government were talking today about this week about building beautiful.
Yes.
You've got 1 million people waiting for social homes. They just need decent homes. Beauty's a luxury, surely.
Beauty is a luxury in one sense, but in another sense, it is a necessity because nobody wants to live in an ugly place. Nobody would want to do that. It won't help the housing crisis. So quantity is critical. I agree with everyone here who said we need to increase housing supply. That's absolutely fundamental. But we have to make sure we're building decent quality places that people want to live in, that are sustainable and that will support the housing market of the future. Because if we don't do that, we're not addressing the housing crisis, we're just postponing it for another generation. So we have to get on board with this idea. Quality beauty doesn't have to be expensive. I can show you all kinds of developments. They've had loads of money thrown in them and they're awful. So it doesn't have to be expensive. Beauty is not just a cost consideration, and we have to make sure that it becomes as commonplace as other considerations like demand or kind of mortgage rates when we're deciding where we want to live.
But do you not think that the market should be the arbiter of beauty, not the Secretary of State being the sole arbiter of what is or isn't beautiful in the UK?
I see this argument, and it's a seductive argument because beauty is subjective to a degree, but there are quantifiable objective standards about what makes good places that we should incorporate more. Public spaces, trees, well-designed rooms, houses, frontages, etc. We should have that as a matter of course.
Completely agree with that.
There is so much more I want to talk about that another day, perhaps, because we're running out of time. But the Prime Minister said just last month, I'm on this. This will be OK in terms of the economy. Danny, what's your sense of that? Danny Hewson.
At the moment, it looks like inflation is slowly beginning to fall, but unfortunately, we are still in for another couple of interest rate hikes. You know, people who are thinking now, I'm going to hang on, I'm just going to wait, and hopefully maybe I'll go on a tracker or I'll go on a variable rate, and then next year it'll be OK. It's probably not going to be OK. Interest rates are going to go up at least twice more, possibly topping out at 5.75%. We're not then expecting to see them even start to come down until at least next summer. And the kind of rates that we've been used to for over a decade, I'm sorry, but I think those are long gone for at least another decade.